you are losing, and you know it. Perhaps in your career, your relationships, your very understanding of who you are meant to be. The pressure mounts, the opposition strengthens. The reasonable voices around you counsel accommodation. Adjust your expectations. Be realistic. Accept the terms available. And some part of you wonders if surrender might bring relief. I understand this moment because I have lived it repeatedly, not once but scores of times across 6 decades. I have felt the terrible weight of choosing between comfortable capitulation and agonizing defiance. I have heard the siren song of those who promise that surrender will preserve what matters most, and I have learned to recognize the lie embedded in that promise. Surrender does not preserve what you value, it merely determines the manner of its loss. When you yield to pressure, to fear, to overwhelming force, you do not save yourself. You only choose the terms of your defeat. But here is the truth they never tell you. Winners surrender all the time, constantly, with calculation and without remorse. They surrender positions, tactics, resources, pride. What they never surrender is the essential thing, and their power lies precisely in knowing what that essential thing is. I shall show you the distinction that separates strategic surrender from soul-destroying capitulation. The lie you've been living. The comfortable platitudes about perseverance that you mouth, winners never quit, never give up, are not merely insufficient, they are dangerous. I have watched these very phrases lead men to defend worthless positions with admirable determination whilst surrendering what truly mattered without a fight. The transformation begins with a brutal truth. You do not understand what surrender means. You believe it is a single, identifiable moment of weakness that can be avoided through willpower. It is not. Surrender happens constantly, dressed in respectable clothing, speaking the language of prudence and calculation. Until you recognize that you are surrendering every hour of every day and have been for years, you cannot begin the work of discriminating wise surrender from fatal capitulation. I watched Neville Chamberlain return from Munich in September 1938, waving a piece of paper and declaring, "Peace for our time." He believed he had avoided surrender through negotiation. The crowds cheered. Cabinet colleagues congratulated him on his realism. Only a handful of us saw the terrible truth. He had surrendered everything whilst believing he had surrendered nothing. Each concession, the Rhineland, Austria, the Sudetenland, had seemed so reasonable. Each calculation had been impeccable. The rhetoric was all of strategic patience, of avoiding premature conflict, of preserving British strength for when it would truly matter. Yet aggregated, these prudent compromises had surrendered Britain's capacity for resistance and ensured the very war they sought to avoid. You see, surrender does not announce itself. It comes dressed as your friend. It speaks in your own voice, uses your own logic, presents calculations you find entirely convincing. When Britain made concessions to Hitler, we called it avoiding the mistakes of 1914. We called it giving peace a chance. We called it strategic restraint. We did not call it surrender. This is the pattern operating in your life at this very moment. You make daily compromises that seem pragmatic, but aggregate into surrender of what matters. Each small yielding to pressure, to others' demands, to comfortable paths, feels insignificant. The pattern remains invisible until catastrophic. Learn to recognize when capitulation dresses as being realistic, abandoning goals when difficulty appears, when it masquerades as being mature, lowering standards to avoid disappointment, when it disguises itself as being strategic, delaying action indefinitely. These phrases seduce because they sound wise. They are cowardice's native tongue. Most believe they can simply decide not to surrender, and that settles the matter. I show you why this fails. You cannot guard against what you cannot recognize. Surrender rarely announces itself as surrender. It must be identified through its effects, not its appearance. This requires different thinking entirely. When you face pressure to compromise on a project, relationship, or standard, stop and ask, would I recognize this as surrender if I saw someone else doing it? This simple test cuts through your own rationalizations with remarkable efficiency. The greatest danger is believing you'll recognize surrender when it arrives. You won't. It will speak your own voice, use your own logic, present calculations you find convincing. Do not use this teaching to judge others' compromises harshly whilst excusing your own. That misses the point entirely. And do not believe that recognizing the pattern means you've solved it. Recognition is merely the first step. The hard work follows. You exit this chapter permanently, unable to trust your own rationalizations. This is profoundly unsettling and absolutely necessary. The comfortable certainty that you know when you're standing firm versus when you're capitulating has been shattered. You now suspect that many decisions you called pragmatic were actually surrender, and positions you defended fiercely might have been peripheral nonsense. This uncertainty, though uncomfortable, opens the door to genuine wisdom. You cannot learn what you believe you already know, but if your own judgment cannot be trusted, if surrender disguises itself so completely, how do you navigate? What principle distinguishes wise flexibility from fatal capitulation? The answer lies not in how surrender feels, but in what it costs. The mathematics of slow defeat. Surrender does not destroy you in one dramatic moment. It compounds like debt. Each yielding, each lowered standard, each abandoned principle, each compromise that doesn't really matter, makes the next surrender easier, until capitulation becomes habitual. I have watched men of considerable talent reduce themselves to shadows through this process. They could not point to a single catastrophic defeat. Instead, they made 1,000 reasonable adjustments, each seemingly insignificant, that aggregated into complete submission to circumstance. This chapter teaches you to recognize the mathematics of gradual surrender, how small concessions multiply, how the muscle of resistance atrophies, and how you lose even the memory of what it felt like to stand firm. I observed a colleague in Parliament who began his career with fierce principles. His first compromise seemed trivial, voting against his conscience on a minor bill for party unity. He told himself it was strategic, that one could not be effective without some accommodation to political reality. The second compromise felt necessary for his career advancement. After all, one must think of one's position. By his 10th year, he voted as told without internal struggle. The most tragic part was not that he had changed, but that he could no longer remember feeling otherwise. When I mentioned the principles he once championed with such passion, he looked at me with genuine confusion, as if I were recalling a stranger. The man he had been erased so gradually that the erasure itself was invisible. You see, each surrender makes you someone who has surrendered. This changes you, not because you are weak, but because you must justify past choices to yourself. The mind constructs elaborate logic. I've already compromised on X, so Y isn't really different. This internal reasoning chains you to escalating capitulation. Breaking this requires recognizing the pattern before it controls you. Just as unused muscles weaken, the capacity to say no deteriorates with disuse. If you consistently yield to pressure from bosses, from family, from circumstances, your resistance mechanism literally weakens. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes to stand firm, even when you desperately wish to. Resistance is a capability that requires exercise. Most insidious of all, chronic surrender erases your memory of autonomy. You forget you ever had a choice. When someone suggests standing firm, it feels impossible not because circumstances prevent it, but because you can no longer imagine yourself as someone who stands firm. The very conception of yourself has been rewritten. Track one area where you routinely compromise with your employer, your schedule, your standards, your relationships. For a fortnight, keep a simple log. Today I yielded on this specific issue because of this reason. At the end, count how many times you used the same justification. This reveals your habitual surrender pattern with uncomfortable clarity. Now test it. Choose one recurring compromise and refuse it once. Not permanently, just once. Note your internal resistance, others' reactions, and the actual consequences versus your fears. This experiment demonstrates that your sense of necessity is often learned helplessness disguised as realism. Most surrenders you believe are mandatory are merely habitual. Do not confuse this teaching with obstinacy. Standing firm on everything is as foolish as yielding on everything. The point is recovering your capacity to choose. You will rationalize. When you refuse something, your mind will immediately generate reasons why this particular refusal was safe, why this case doesn't count. Resist this. You're discovering you have more freedom than you believed. That discovery changes everything. You begin seeing the invisible chains of your own habitual compliance. Requests you've always accepted without thought suddenly appear as choices you've been making unconsciously. The phrase, "I have to," starts revealing itself as, "I've always chosen to." This is uncomfortable. It means you cannot blame circumstances for where you are, but it's also liberating. If your current position resulted from choices, different choices produce different positions. You now understand that surrender compounds, that resistance atrophies, and that most constraints you experience are habits, not necessities. But this raises an urgent question. If you must recover your capacity to resist, how do you know what to resist and what to yield? Without this discrimination, you risk defending nonsense. The question that changes everything. The fundamental question is never, should I surrender? But rather, what shall I surrender, and what shall I defend with every resource I command? This shift from binary thinking to discriminating thinking represents the crucial transformation. Most men exhaust themselves trying to defend everything because they fear that any yielding represents failure. Others surrender everything because they believe one cannot resist the tides of circumstance. Both are fools. Wisdom lies in recognition that you will surrender constantly. Time surrenders itself merely by passing. Opportunities foreclose with every choice. Mortality itself guarantees eventual surrender of everything physical. The question is never whether to surrender, but what to surrender, and why. Once this truth penetrates consciousness, you can begin actual strategic thinking rather than reactive resistance or passive capitulation. In my escape from Pretoria prison during the Boer War, I faced this choice in its purest form. I could attempt dramatic heroism, fight my guards, try to overpower them openly, or I could hide in a railway truck like a common thief. Pride counseled the former. Every romantic notion of how an officer should conduct himself demanded visible courage. Survival demanded the latter. I surrendered every shred of dignity, every notion of proper behavior. I lay in darkness while soldiers searched above me, their boots inches from my hiding place. My heart pounded so loudly I feared it would betray me. Was this surrender? Absolutely. Was this defeat? Not remotely. I had surrendered means whilst preserving ends. That distinction saved my life. Most thinking about perseverance is binary, either resist everything or give up entirely. This false choice paralyzes judgment. I teach a third way, conscious discrimination. You will surrender constantly. Make those surrenders strategic rather than reactive. This requires shifting from, am I surrendering, which produces guilt and confusion, to, am I surrendering wisely, which produces clarity. Military strategy has long understood that retreat is not defeat if it preserves capacity to fight another day. Wellington's retreat to Torres Vedras saved Portugal by drawing Napoleon's forces into a trap of their own exhaustion. Napoleon's refusal to retreat from Moscow destroyed his army through pride and inability to distinguish between tactical withdrawal and strategic defeat. The difference was not courage, but clarity about what mattered. Teach yourself to ask, does this retreat preserve my capacity to achieve my actual objective, or does it surrender that objective itself? This question cuts through emotional confusion to strategic reality. I surrendered many positions, ministerial posts, even party affiliation across my career. What I never surrendered was the right to speak truth as I saw it, and the readiness to serve when called. These were ends, everything else was means. When facing pressure to compromise, stop and write 2 lists. If I yield on this, what do I surrender? And if I yield on this, what do I preserve or gain capacity for? Be brutally specific. Preserve relationship is too vague to be useful. Preserve my colleague's willingness to support me on the railway proposal is actionable. Most discover that surrendering the immediate demand preserves something more valuable. The act of writing forces clarity that mental reasoning cannot achieve. Keep these lists. Review them in 3 months to see if your predictions proved accurate. This builds your capacity for accurate discrimination through empirical feedback rather than mere theory. The danger is using this framework to rationalize surrenders you know are wrong. I'm being strategic becomes the new disguise for capitulation. To guard against this, apply one test. If you succeed in your objective, will you look back on this surrender as wise or as the moment you lost your way? If you cannot answer honestly, you don't yet have sufficient clarity. Wait, gather more information. Don't make the decision until clarity emerges. The binary paralysis dissolves. You stop experiencing every choice as surrender and fail versus resist and succeed. Instead, you see a landscape of strategic options: what to yield, what to defend, what to delay, what to compromise on. This is profoundly liberating. The grinding tension of trying to resist everything lifts. You can actually think rather than just react. Decisions that seemed impossible become complex but navigable. You have graduated from binary reactive mode to strategic discriminating mode. But discrimination requires knowing what you discriminate between. You must identify what matters versus what merely seems to matter. This requires confronting an uncomfortable truth. Most people, perhaps including you, do not actually know what they fight for, the one thing you cannot lose. Every human endeavor has a core, the thing without which the endeavor loses all meaning, and a periphery of tactics, methods, and strategies that must be endlessly adjusted. The tragedy of most men is twofold. They defend peripheral positions as though they were core, exhausting themselves in battles that don't matter, or they surrender the core whilst congratulating themselves on being pragmatic about tactics. Until you identify your core with brutal precision, all other wisdom remains inapplicable. You cannot discriminate between wise and foolish surrender until you know what must never be surrendered. This chapter teaches the method of core identification, not through vague inspiration, but through systematic examination, historical study, and the stripping away of comfortable self-deceptions. In May 1940, when France fell and colleagues proposed negotiating with Hitler, the question crystallized: what was Britain's core? Lord Halifax argued that survival itself was the core, therefore negotiate to preserve national existence in some form. His logic was impeccable. We could not win militarily. Germany controlled the continent. Our army had barely escaped Dunkirk. Negotiation from a position of relative strength now might preserve something. I saw differently. Liberty was the core. British survival without liberty meant nothing. We would exist but have surrendered the very purpose of existence. Better to risk destruction defending the core than to survive having surrendered it. This clarity, achieved through years of thought, made the decision straightforward despite its terrible stakes. The choice was agonizing but not complex. Vague cores like success or happiness are useless because they provide no guidance in crisis. When France fell, did Britain's survival mean any form of national existence, or did it mean something more specific? Only the precise definition liberty itself allowed clear action. Your core must be specific enough to guide actual decisions. Build a successful business is vague and therefore operationally worthless. Create financial independence to pursue creative work is precise and actionable. Most men claim they fight for one thing, but their behavior reveals they fight for something else. They say family but defend ego. They say principles but protect comfort. They say legacy but pursue immediate gratification. Honest assessment requires examining not what you say matters, but where you actually invest time, energy, and attention. These reveal your true core, which may differ dramatically from your stated core. The gap between profession and practice is where self-deception flourishes most vigorously. Identify your core by imagining surrendering everything else. If you lost your position, your wealth, your reputation but retained X, could you continue? If yes, X approaches your core. If no, you haven't found it yet. This is not comfortable philosophy. This is surgical examination. Most discover their stated objective depends on things they claimed were peripheral. Write your life's objective as you currently understand it. Now conduct the stripping exercise. If I achieved this objective but lost reputation, would the achievement still matter? Work through wealth, others' approval, comfort, control, particular relationships. Continue the process until you reach something that, if you possessed it, would matter even if you lost everything else. That approaches your core. Warning: this exercise is disturbing. You may not like what you discover. The seduction of noble-sounding cores leads many to identify cores that sound impressive but aren't actually theirs. Serving humanity might be genuine for some, but for most it's what they believe they should value rather than what they actually do value. This dishonesty cripples decision-making. Better to identify an honest core that sounds selfish than to claim a noble core that isn't truly yours. You cannot navigate by a map of someone else's territory. Your true core may disappoint your ideal self. Accept it anyway. Self-deception in service of appearing noble produces nothing but confusion and failure. You move from vague aspirations to precise understanding of what you actually fight for. This is simultaneously humbling. Your actual core may be simpler or less noble than you imagined, and empowering. For the first time, you can actually answer the question, what am I building, with specificity rather than inspiring generalities. This precision transforms all subsequent decision-making. You now have an actual criterion against which to evaluate what to defend and what to surrender, but identification is only the beginning. The brutal truth follows. Most men cannot identify their core because they fear what they'll discover. They prefer comfortable vagueness to uncomfortable clarity. The deceptions you tell yourself. The greatest obstacle to identifying your core is not lack of intelligence but active self-deception. You tell yourself you fight for your business when you actually fight for others' validation. You claim to pursue a relationship when you actually pursue the feeling of being needed. You defend principles when you actually defend comfort. This deception is not mere dishonesty, it is the ego's survival mechanism. Admitting what you actually value might reveal values that disappoint your ideal self, so the mind constructs noble stories whilst behavior reveals baser truths. This chapter teaches you to recognize the signs of self-deception and provides the brutal honesty required to see past your own stories to the actual motivations beneath. For years, I defended British control of India with fierce conviction. I told myself and others that this was about preserving order, protecting Indians from chaos, maintaining Britain's strategic position in the East. These were genuine concerns. I believed them sincerely. My arguments were cogent, my passion real. But deeper honesty revealed something else. I could not bear to see the empire I had grown up believing in dissolve on my watch. My identity as guardian of that empire drove my position more than strategic calculation. The very conception of myself formed in childhood, reinforced by military service, embedded in every assumption about Britain's place in the world, depended upon this empire continuing. Until I confronted this honestly, I could not make sound judgments about what truly mattered. The self-deception hadn't made me wrong necessarily, but it had made me unable to think clearly. My reasoning served my identity rather than objective assessment. This is how self-deception operates, not through conscious lying but through the mind's unconscious protection of itself. The most common deception is confusing ego needs with core purpose. You believe you defend a business decision because it serves the business. Actually, you defend it because changing course would mean admitting error, which wounds ego. This confusion is nearly universal and deadly. Test every core commitment. Am I defending this because it matters to the objective, or because surrendering it would embarrass me? 3 signs reveal self-deception operating. First, you become defensive when questioned. If your core is genuine, questions clarify. If it's ego in disguise, questions threaten. Second, your stated values don't match your behavior. You claim family matters most, but work 80 hours weekly. Third, you cannot articulate why something matters without circular reasoning. It matters because it's important. These signs reveal the gap between story and truth. Stop listening to what you say and watch what you do. Where do you actually invest time, energy, attention, resources? This reveals true priorities, which often differ dramatically from stated values. For 1 week, track where your time actually goes. Not where you wish it went or where your calendar says it should go, where it actually goes in 30-minute increments. At week's end, compare this reality to your stated priorities. Most discover their behavior reveals values they didn't know they held: approval seeking, conflict avoidance, comfort preservation, image management. This is not judgment but data. Now ask, if your behavior reveals your actual core, can you live with that? If yes, own it and build strategy around it. If no, you have just identified the gap between your current core and your desired core. Either close the gap or stop lying about it. The exhausting split between what you claim to value and what you actually pursue must end. The danger is using this awareness to berate yourself. I'm terrible because I claim X but do Y. That's not the point. Self-judgment prevents the honest observation required. Better to admit, I do Y, and build strategy accordingly, than to insist, I value X, whilst continuing Y. Friends and family invested in your stated values may resist your honesty. They preferred the noble story. Your truth may inconvenience them. Proceed anyway. You stop performing for an imaginary audience that demands noble motivations. This is profoundly relieving. You can finally stop pretending to yourself. The energy previously spent maintaining the deception becomes available for actual work. You may not love what your honest inventory reveals, but at least you're working with accurate information. From this foundation, real change becomes possible. From deception, only confusion follows. Having identified your actual core through painful honesty, you now face the final challenge of Part 2, developing the capacity to defend that core whilst surrendering everything else. This requires a skill most men never cultivate: the ability to let go without regret. Chapter 6. The liberation of letting go. Once you have identified your core with brutal precision, the greatest remaining obstacle is the inability to surrender what doesn't serve it. Men clutch at peripheral positions, maintaining commitments that drain them, preserving relationships that provide no sustenance, defending strategies that have clearly failed. Why? Because surrender, even of what doesn't matter, feels like defeat. The ego intervenes, pride resists, the sunk cost of past investment blinds judgment. This chapter teaches the discipline of strategic abandonment, how to perform surgery on your commitments, how to recognize when a position has become untenable, and most importantly, how to surrender the periphery without hesitation or regret so you can defend the core with concentrated force. This is not callousness but clarity. I surrendered my party when it surrendered its principles, crossing from conservative to liberal in 1904. The Conservatives had opposed necessary social reform, had turned their backs on the working classes whose welfare I believed essential to Britain's strength. 20 years later, I crossed back when the Liberals embraced policies I believed dangerous to the nation. Was this opportunism? My critics certainly claimed so, but I understood something they did not. Party affiliation was peripheral to my core purpose of serving Britain according to my best judgment. When the Conservatives opposed reform that would strengthen the nation, I left. When the Liberals embraced socialism that would weaken it, I left again. Each departure required swallowing considerable pride, enduring vicious criticism, accepting political uncertainty. But I never surrendered what mattered: the right to act according to my conscience. You maintain a business strategy because you've invested 5 years, even though it's clearly failing. You preserve a relationship because you've invested time, even though it's clearly toxic. You defend a position because you've staked reputation on it, even though evidence has proven you wrong. This is the sunk cost fallacy operating in life rather than business. The cure is brutal. Past investment is gone regardless. The only question is whether continuing investment serves your core. If not, cut it today. Most feel guilty surrendering anything: friendships that have run their course, projects that no longer serve, positions that circumstances have rendered untenable. This guilt prevents necessary pruning. Reframe. Surrendering what doesn't serve your core is not betrayal but fidelity to what matters. Would a gardener feel guilty pruning dead branches? You're doing the same work, but in life rather than horticulture. Before maintaining any commitment, ask, does this serve my core? Did it ever serve my core? If circumstances changed, would I recommit to this? 2. No answers means surrender it. List every significant commitment: professional projects, relationships, regular obligations, voluntary activities. For each, answer the 3 questions honestly. You'll likely find several that fail the test: they once mattered but no longer do, or they never truly mattered but you accepted them through inability to refuse. Choose one, not the easiest or hardest, just one. This week, take action to exit it. This doesn't always mean immediate termination. Sometimes graceful withdrawal takes time, but it means beginning the process. Note your internal resistance, your rationalizations for maintaining what doesn't serve you. This awareness itself teaches volumes about why you clutch at peripheral commitments. Do not confuse strategic abandonment with impulsive burning of bridges. Graceful exits preserve relationships and options. Dramatic departures might feel satisfying but often create unnecessary enemies. Others will resist your pruning. People benefit from your peripheral commitments. When you withdraw from obligations that don't serve your core, you deprive them of your resources. They will call you selfish. They're not entirely wrong. You are choosing self-determination over their convenience. Proceed anyway, but kindly. You discover that most of what you believed you had to maintain was optional. The schedule that seemed immovable proves remarkably flexible. The relationships you thought you couldn't end turn out to be survivable endings. The projects you feared abandoning continue fine without you, or, if they fail, reveal they weren't your responsibility to carry. This discovery is intoxicating. You have far more freedom than you believed. The chains were mostly self-imposed. You now possess the framework. Core versus periphery, the non-negotiable versus the endlessly negotiable. You've identified your actual core and begun surrendering what doesn't serve it. But intellectual understanding differs vastly from execution under pressure. Part 3 addresses this gap between principle and practice, between theory and embodied capability. Part EA, the discipline of discrimination. Chapter 7, learning through loss. You cannot identify what truly matters through comfortable contemplation. You discover your core by actually surrendering things and observing what you cannot bear to lose. This is not philosophical speculation but empirical investigation. You must test your assumptions against reality. Most men try to identify their core through pure thought. imagining what they would defend in crisis. This fails utterly. Under actual pressure, theoretical commitments evaporate, whilst unexpected values emerge as non-negotiable. The only reliable method of core identification is systematic experimentation. Surrender things you believe are peripheral, and observe whether you were right. When you surrender something and discover you cannot function without it, you have identified core. When you surrender something you believed essential and discover you're fine, you have eliminated a false assumption. My father's death in 1895 forced a surrender I had not chosen. I had to abandon hope of earning his approval, of proving to him I could amount to something. This was devastating. Lord Randolph Churchill died before I could demonstrate that I was not the disappointment he believed me to be. The opportunity to prove myself to him vanished forever. But in the devastation, I discovered something unexpected. I could not surrender the determination to prove my worth to history. The specific audience changed from my father to posterity, but the drive remained. Loss revealed what was truly core, not paternal validation, but the inner requirement to demonstrate capability. I could not have identified this through reflection alone. Only the forced surrender revealed the bedrock beneath. Treat your life as a laboratory. You believe X is peripheral? Test it, surrender it temporarily, and observe what happens. Most discoveries contradict predictions. You thought the client relationship was crucial. Surrendering it reveals you're liberated. You thought the title was peripheral. Losing it reveals you're devastated. Only experimentation produces accurate data about your actual values versus your theoretical values. After any significant surrender, chosen or forced, observe three things. First, your immediate emotional response. Relief indicates it was peripheral. Panic indicates you may have surrendered core or haven't yet adapted. Second, your capability, 6 weeks later. Most peripheral surrenders leave you more capable, not less. Third, what you actually miss. Often, it's not the thing itself, but what it represented. These observations refine your understanding of your core. Forced losses produce trauma and confusion. Chosen surrenders produce data and clarity. Practice voluntary surrender of small things to build the skill and gather information. Choose one thing you believe is peripheral but have never surrendered. A weekly obligation, a social commitment, a business practice, a relationship maintenance habit. For 1 month, suspend it entirely. Not reduce, suspend. Observe what happens to your life, your work, your well-being, your core objectives. Most discover one of two things. Either the peripheral thing was truly peripheral and nothing important suffers, or the peripheral thing was secretly supporting something core and its absence creates unexpected consequences. Both discoveries are valuable. The first teaches what you can safely abandon. The second reveals hidden connections you didn't recognize. Either way, you now have data rather than assumptions. The seduction of dramatic surrenders. Some will use this as license to burn down their lives in the name of finding their core. That's not experimentation, it's destruction. Start small. Surrender peripheral commitments before major relationships. Some losses reveal their impact slowly. Do not conclude something was peripheral just because you don't miss it after 3 days. The full impact of loss often takes weeks or months to manifest. Patience in evaluation prevents premature conclusions. You shift from theoretical understanding to empirical knowledge. Your sense of what matters derives not from what you think should matter, but from actual testing under real conditions. This produces confidence that no amount of philosophy can generate. When someone tells you that X is crucial, you can say, "I've tested that," and proceed according to your data rather than their assertions. This transformation from speculation to knowledge changes everything. You're now navigating by experience rather than guessing. But experimentation reveals another problem. Even when you know what matters, the ego continually fools you into defending what doesn't. This self-deception operates at subtle levels that conscious awareness cannot easily detect. Chapter 8. The Enemy Within. The primary obstacle to maintaining discrimination between core and periphery is not external pressure, but internal deception. Your ego has one imperative: preserve itself. It accomplishes this by disguising its own needs as core purposes. You believe you defend a business decision because it serves the business. Actually, you defend it because surrender would mean admitting error, which wounds ego. You think you maintain a relationship because it matters. Actually, you maintain it because ending it would require uncomfortable confrontation, which ego avoids. Until you learn to recognize when ego is operating, disguising its self-preservation as defense of principle. You cannot trust your own judgment about what to defend. This chapter teaches the methods for detecting ego's deceptions and acting despite them. During my political exile in the 1930 seconds, I received many invitations to moderate my warnings about Hitler in exchange for political restoration. My ego desperately wanted acceptance back into government. After years in the wilderness, the prospect of influence again was intoxicating. My ego constructed elaborate rationalizations. "You can influence more from inside the cabinet than from outside," it whispered. "One can speak truth more effectively from a position of power. Perhaps you're wrong about Hitler's intentions, perhaps Chamberlain sees something you've missed." All compelling, all ego's voice disguised as strategic thinking. Only by recognizing these as ego protection rather than strategic calculation could I maintain my actual course, which was speaking truth regardless of political consequence. When defending any position, ask, "If I surrendered this, what would others think of me?" If the thought produces anxiety, ego is operating. If I changed course, what would I have to admit about past decisions? If answer involves admitting error, ego is defending itself. What am I actually afraid of? If answer relates to image, status, or being wrong rather than actual harm, ego is in control. These questions bypass ego's stories to reveal its actual operation. The clearest sign ego has hijacked discrimination is your emotional response to questioning. If someone questions your position and you become defensive rather than curious, ego is operating. Core purpose welcomes scrutiny because it knows its own foundation. Ego resists scrutiny because it fears exposure. Monitor your reaction to challenges. Defensiveness is the alarm bell. When facing a decision, imagine advising someone else in your situation. What would you counsel them? Usually, this produces clearer thinking because your ego has no stake in the other person's choices. The gap between what you'd advise others and what you do yourself reveals where ego controls decisions. This week, when defending any position or refusing to change course, pause and ask the 3 ego detection questions. Write down your answers honestly. Many positions you believe principled will reveal themselves as ego protection. This is not condemnation. Ego operates in everyone, but awareness allows choice. Once you recognize ego is operating, you can decide, yes, ego wants this, but is it actually wise? Sometimes the answer is still yes, but consciously. Other times, you'll recognize you're defending nonsense to protect ego and can choose differently. The practice is not eliminating ego, but recognizing when it speaks, so you can evaluate its advice rather than unconsciously obey it. The danger is using ego awareness as another ego defense. I'm so evolved that I recognize my ego, therefore I'm beyond its influence. That's ego speaking. Recognizing ego doesn't eliminate it. Everyone faces this opponent constantly, including those who've practiced for decades. Calling out others' ego whilst blind to your own is the surest sign ego controls you. The work is always internal first. Judge yourself honestly. Judge others rarely. That's the only path that produces growth rather than self-righteousness. You develop what might be called split vision. You can observe yourself defending something while simultaneously recognizing that's ego talking and choosing whether to listen. This doesn't mean ego disappears, but you're no longer its unconscious servant. Decisions that once seemed obviously right reveal themselves as ego protection. Positions you defended fiercely show themselves as image management. This awareness allows genuine choice for the first time. You can choose to serve ego or override it, but consciously. But consciousness is not enough. Even when you recognize ego operating, even when you know what discrimination requires, execution under pressure remains difficult. Chapter 9. Discrimination in the Storm. Understanding discrimination intellectually, even recognizing ego's deceptions, means little when crisis arrives. Under pressure, when fear grips you, when reasonable voices counsel surrender, when the cost of defending your core rises higher than you imagined, the framework you understood perfectly in calm dissolves into confusion. This is when most men fail. They grasp the principle but cannot execute it under fire. This chapter addresses the specific challenge of maintaining discrimination under extreme pressure. It teaches the practices that make discrimination not just understood but embodied, the techniques that allow you to access clarity when circumstances would otherwise produce panic, and the realistic expectations about what mastery actually means in practice rather than theory. In May 1940, when the cabinet met to discuss Halifax's proposal for negotiating with Hitler, I felt the full weight of circumstances against me. France had fallen within weeks. The French army we had believed impregnable had collapsed like a house of cards. Our own army had barely escaped Dunkirk, abandoning nearly all its equipment on the beaches. We possessed no credible path to victory. Every calculation suggested we could not win. Reasonable men, good men, argued that negotiation would preserve something. Halifax's logic was impeccable. Negotiate now from a position of relative strength, before invasion makes our position even weaker. The pressure to abandon my position was immense, not just external but internal. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps my stubbornness would destroy what negotiation could save. That moment taught me that discrimination under pressure requires not just clear thinking but pre-decided commitment. I survived the moment because I had already decided what I would not surrender. The time to decide what you'll defend is not in crisis but in calm. When pressure arrives, you will not have the clarity to make sound discriminations. But if you have already decided in writing, with clear reasoning what your core is and what you will never surrender, crisis becomes execution rather than decision-making. Create your list of non-negotiables when calm. In crisis, refer to it rather than trying to think clearly under pressure. This single practice prevents most pressure-induced capitulations. When pressure demands immediate surrender, implement a simple rule. No major surrenders within 72 hours of the pressure's arrival. Panic produces terrible decisions. Creating space just 3 days allows emotions to settle and judgment to return. Most pressure that seems urgent is artificial urgency designed to prevent clear thinking. The rule protects you from pressure's primary tactic, the demand for immediate decision. Study how others have faced similar pressures. Wellington at Torres Vedras, showing that strategic retreat can be more powerful than holding untenable ground. Lincoln, during the Civil War's dark days, maintaining clarity about preserving the Union when others counseled accommodation. Elizabeth facing the Armada, refusing panic when invasion seemed certain. These precedents teach your mind to recognize patterns. Right now, before crisis arrives, write your list of non-negotiables, the 3 to 5 things you will not surrender regardless of pressure. Be specific. Not my integrity, but I will not misrepresent data to clients, even if this costs the contract. Not my relationships, but I will maintain weekly connection with my children regardless of work demands. Place this somewhere you can access during crisis. When pressure arrives demanding immediate surrender, first step, delay if possible. Second step, retrieve your list. Third step, evaluate the demand against your pre-decided commitments. This sequence, delay, review, evaluate, prevents panic-driven surrender. Most crisis decisions improve dramatically with even 72 hours of space. The seduction of "this is different." When crisis hits, your mind will generate reasons why this situation is unique, why your framework doesn't apply here, why exceptional circumstances require exceptional flexibility. This is almost always ego finding an escape. Your framework exists precisely for crisis. That's when you need it most. Others will use your commitment to discrimination against you, calling it rigidity. Why can't you be flexible? Translates to, why won't you surrender what matters? You develop what might be called crisis competence, the capacity to maintain clarity under pressure that would produce confusion in others. When circumstances deteriorate, when panic spreads, when voices counsel capitulation, you can access your pre-decided commitments and act accordingly. This does not mean you never feel fear or doubt. It means you can act rightly despite them. The fear remains. The paralysis ends. You're still in the storm, but you're navigating rather than drowning. You now possess the complete tactical framework, identifying core versus periphery, recognizing ego's deceptions, maintaining discrimination under pressure. But as you practice these skills, a deeper question emerges. What does this capacity actually represent? Part IV. The Architecture of Freedom. Chapter 10. What liberty actually means. True freedom, not the abstract freedom of political philosophy, but the lived freedom of actual existence, consists precisely in the capacity to choose what you surrender and what you defend. The slave surrenders everything to his master's will and thus possesses no freedom. The man imprisoned by circumstance, though legally free, has equally lost liberty through inability to discriminate. He fights for everything indiscriminately, surrendering his capacity for strategic action. Liberty is not the absence of surrender, but the sovereignty to determine one's surrenders. This reframing transforms everything you understood about freedom. It reveals why tyranny always seeks to eliminate the distinction between core and periphery, declaring everything matters to the state, that no sphere may remain private, because the capacity to discriminate is the foundation of human dignity itself. Hitler understood this perfectly, which is why Nazi totalitarianism penetrated every sphere of life. Private association, family decisions, personal reading, religious practice, artistic creation, all were declared political, all subordinated to state interest. This was not mere control-seeking, but recognition of a profound truth. If a man can say, "This sphere is mine, here the state's writ does not run," he possesses the core of freedom. Destroy that capacity to discriminate between public and private, between what belongs to Caesar and what doesn't, and you destroy liberty itself whilst leaving the forms of freedom intact. The Gestapo didn't just monitor political activity, they monitored everything. What you read, whom you befriended, what jokes you told, what you believed in the privacy of your own thoughts. This total surveillance wasn't paranoia, it was strategic elimination of the private sphere where discrimination is practiced. Most believe freedom means doing what you want. This is adolescent understanding. Mature freedom is the capacity to choose your surrenders. You will surrender constantly. Time surrenders through mere passage. Every choice forecloses alternatives. Mortality itself guarantees eventual loss of everything physical. The question is never whether to surrender, but who decides what to surrender and why. The free man decides. The slave has others decide for him. The man imprisoned by circumstance has his incapacity to discriminate decide for him. Liberty is this deciding capacity, nothing more or less. Private life spheres where you make autonomous decisions about what matters is liberty's training ground. Totalitarians recognize this and eliminate privacy systematically, not through paranoia but through strategic understanding. The capacity to discriminate in small matters, what to read, whom to befriend, what to believe, builds the capacity to discriminate in large matters, whether to obey unjust laws, whether to resist oppression, defend privacy zealously. It's where freedom lives. Examine your life for spheres where others determine your surrenders, your employer deciding what evenings you work, social expectations deciding whom you befriend, family demands deciding how you spend weekends, consumer pressure deciding what you purchase. Each represents partial surrender of liberty, not wrongly, necessarily, but notice them. Now identify one sphere where you can reassert autonomous discrimination. Perhaps you've let work dictate evening availability. Reclaim one evening weekly as non-negotiable personal time. Others will resist. They benefited from your previous surrender of this choice. This resistance confirms you're reclaiming actual freedom. The practice is not eliminating all external influence, but consciously choosing where to accept it and where to reject it. The danger is confusing liberty with license, believing freedom means doing whatever you want without consequence. Foolish. Freedom is choosing your constraints wisely rather than having constraints chosen for you. You will be constrained by mortality, by others' rights, by physical reality. The question is whether you choose which constraints to accept or have them imposed. Reclaiming sovereignty threatens those benefiting from your previous passivity. Expect resistance. Proceed anyway. You begin experiencing freedom not as absence of constraint, but as presence of autonomous choice. This is simultaneously sobering. You're responsible for your position, having chosen the surrenders that produced it, and empowering. If past choices produced current position, different choices produce different positions. The victim mentality dissolves. You cannot blame circumstances for where you are because you now recognize that you chose which circumstances to accept. This is uncomfortable. It's also the only path to genuine agency. But if discrimination constitutes liberty, and liberty requires continuous conscious choice of one's surrenders, then this principle must operate in every human sphere. Chapter 11. The Universal Pattern. The capacity to discriminate between core and periphery is not merely a principle of personal achievement or political survival. It operates as a fundamental structure across every domain of human activity. In art, the painter who cannot surrender unsuccessful brushstrokes creates confusion, not beauty. In science, the investigator who cannot surrender elegant theories when evidence contradicts them abandons scientific method itself. In love, the partner who cannot surrender idealized images cannot embrace actual reality. In parenthood, the parent who cannot surrender control cannot cultivate independence. The pattern repeats with mathematical precision because it reflects something essential about excellence itself. Flourishing requires knowing what to hold and what to release. This universality suggests you have not learned a tactic but discovered an organizing principle of reality itself. I took up painting in my 40s, finding unexpected solace and education in the practice. Early work was terrible. I clutched at every stroke, afraid to surrender any mark I had made. Each brushstroke represented effort, and surrendering it felt like admitting failure. The canvas became a museum of mistakes I refused to abandon. Gradually, I learned that a good painting requires ruthless elimination. This stroke serves the composition, that one doesn't. Hours of work might be painted over if they don't serve the whole. The parallel to political life was unmistakable. In both painting and governance, excellence demands continuous discrimination between what serves the ultimate purpose and what merely represents sunk investment. Science advances not through accumulating theories but through surrendering disproven ones. A scientist attached to his elegant hypothesis, even after evidence contradicts it, has abandoned science. But the scientist who develops theories knowing he must surrender them when data demands it, he advances knowledge. This is discrimination in pure form. Hold the method rigorously. Surrender the conclusions when evidence requires. The same structure operates in your work. Identify the method you'll never surrender, then surrender specific strategies freely when they prove ineffective. Every artist faces the same challenge: emotional attachment to unsuccessful work. Hours invested, passion spent, yet the piece doesn't serve the whole. Amateur artists clutch at every element. Masters eliminate ruthlessly. They've learned to discriminate between the work itself, which is core, and specific elements of that work, which are periphery. Your life is the art. Specific projects, relationships, and commitments are elements. Some must be eliminated to serve the whole. To love someone truly requires surrendering who you wish they were to embrace who they actually are. This is perhaps the most difficult discrimination of all. Choose one domain where you've been struggling: a creative project, a business venture, a relationship pattern. Examine it through the discrimination lens. What is the core purpose? What are you clutching that doesn't serve that purpose? In creative work, which elements aren't working but you're keeping because you spent time on them? In business, which strategies have failed but you're maintaining because admitting failure wounds ego? In relationships, which expectations aren't serving connection but you're maintaining because surrendering them feels like settling? Once you identify what should be surrendered, take action this week to release it. The immediate improvement in the work, in the relationship, in your clarity, demonstrates the universal applicability of discrimination. The seduction of seeing patterns everywhere. Some will use this framework to judge every human activity, becoming insufferable analysts who miss life whilst analyzing it. The framework is a tool, not a religion. Use it where it's useful. Set it aside elsewhere. Applying discrimination to others' lives without invitation is arrogance masquerading as helpfulness. The work is always primarily your own discrimination, not improving others' capacity to discriminate. That's their work, not yours. You begin recognizing the same core periphery pattern operating everywhere you look. This is not mere pattern matching, but genuine recognition. You're seeing a real structure that operates across domains. This recognition produces two effects. First, confidence that the principle is sound, proven by its universality. Second, understanding that mastery in any domain requires the same fundamental skill, discriminating between what serves the purpose and what merely occupies space. Excellence across domains suddenly seems more accessible. It's the same skill, differently applied. But if this principle operates universally, it must also address the ultimate human challenge: mortality itself. Chapter 12. Facing the final surrender. Mortality demands the ultimate discrimination. What makes life worth living versus mere biological continuation? The man who has never learned discrimination clutches at life itself as if duration were the core purpose, which makes every hour a desperate battle against the inevitable and every moment lost to aging a tragedy. But the wise man has learned to distinguish. Biological continuation is periphery. The core is living according to truth, duty, and honor the things that give life meaning beyond mere existence. This discrimination transforms your relationship to death from terror to acceptance, not through denial or faith, but through clarity about what you actually value. When you know your core, you know what you protect until death and what you can surrender, including eventually life itself, without defeat. In the Boer War, trapped in an armored train under fire, I faced real possibility of death. The Boers had derailed our train with artillery. We were pinned down, exposed, taking casualties. The fear was present. Any man who claims otherwise is either lying or deficient in imagination. But beneath the fear was clarity. I could surrender life itself if necessary, but I would not surrender having lived according to my understanding of duty and courage. That distinction made death possible to face. Years later, in 1940, the same clarity allowed me to risk Britain's destruction rather than surrender liberty. Biological survival was not the core. Living freely was. When I told the nation we would fight on the beaches, fight on the landing grounds, fight in the fields and in the streets, I was not promising victory. I was defining what we would not surrender even unto death. Death is the ultimate test of discrimination. It strips away everything: peripheral wealth, status, accomplishments, physical capacity, leaving only the question, what was I protecting all along? Most discover they've spent decades defending things that death takes easily, whilst neglecting what death cannot touch: character, integrity, the quality of relationships, the meaning they've created. Recognition of mortality clarifies core versus periphery with brutal efficiency. Use this clarity now, before necessity forces it upon you. Life's length is peripheral. Its quality, measured not in pleasure but in alignment with your core values, is what matters. A man who lives to 90 whilst compromising his principles daily has surrendered more than one who dies at 40 defending what matters. This is not romanticizing early death, but recognizing that counting years is the wrong metric. The question is not how long, but how truly. You will die. What will remain? Not your possessions or achievements, these dissolve rapidly. What remains is the example of how you lived, what you stood for, what you refused to surrender. Conduct a mortality audit. Imagine yourself at death reviewing your current life. Which activities would you be proud to have spent time on? Which relationships would matter? Which stands taken or avoided would you celebrate or regret? This perspective from the end looking back reveals core versus periphery with unusual clarity. Now evaluate your current time allocation against that end-of-life perspective. Most discover massive misalignment, spending time on things they'll barely remember whilst neglecting things they'll wish they'd prioritized. Make one significant change this month to align current allocation with end-of-life values. The urgency mortality provides is clarifying. Use it as strategic advantage rather than waiting for age to force it upon you. The danger is using mortality awareness to justify recklessness. I could die tomorrow, so consequences don't matter. That's not wisdom. It's another form of peripheral thinking. Mortality should clarify what matters, not eliminate consideration of consequences. Some will find this chapter's directness about death disturbing. If so, examine why. Usually, discomfort comes from recognizing we're spending life on periphery whilst neglecting core. That discomfort is the beginning of correction. Mortality shifts from abstract future event to present strategic consideration. You begin making decisions with clear awareness that time is finite, which paradoxically increases rather than decreases your peace. The desperate grasping at longevity eases. You're not trying to postpone death indefinitely, but to live in alignment with core values for whatever duration you're granted. This produces equanimity, not detachment, but appropriate attachment to what actually matters whilst releasing what doesn't. Death becomes a teacher rather than a terror. Part V. The Unconquerable Life. Chapter 13. The Paradox of Power Through Surrender. Here is the final paradox. The more willing you become to surrender, the more unconquerable you become. This seems impossible until lived. The man who clutches at everything can be broken by taking anything threaten his position, his wealth, his reputation. Any lever will move him. But the man who knows his core and freely surrenders everything else cannot be broken. His opponents take position after position, territory after territory, and each time they believe they have won, they discover he has merely retreated to ground that actually matters. He becomes genuinely invincible, not through refusing surrender, but through knowing what need not be defended. This is the ultimate mastery. Strategic surrender creates tactical invincibility. The more you release, the stronger you become. In 1940, Hitler took the continent. I surrendered it, though the word burned like acid in my mouth. France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway, all fallen within weeks. He bombed our cities. We endured it without capitulation. Night after night, the Luftwaffe rained destruction upon London. He sank our ships. We built more. With each loss, observers believed we must surrender. German high command calculated we had no path to victory. They were correct. We didn't, not for years. But what they could not calculate was our willingness to lose everything except the commitment to resist tyranny. We had identified our core and could therefore yield everything peripheral without despair. This produced genuine invincibility. There was nothing they could take that would constitute our defeat. When you practice strategic discrimination, your opponent faces an insoluble problem. They can take positions, resources, territory, but they cannot break you because they cannot identify what would constitute breaking you. Each victory proves hollow. You've merely retreated to positions you actually care about. Eventually, they exhaust themselves taking what doesn't matter to you whilst never touching what does. This is not trickery but clarity about your actual objective versus their assumption about it. In any negotiation, the party willing to surrender everything except their core position possesses decisive advantage. Others cling to peripheral demands, preventing agreement. You yield freely on periphery, appearing flexible whilst being absolutely rigid on core. This confuses opponents. They cannot determine your bottom line because you've gladly surrendered things they expected you to defend. Meanwhile, your core remains unmoved. This flexibility-rigidity combination is nearly unbeatable. Each successful strategic surrender, yielding what doesn't matter whilst preserving what does, builds confidence for larger surrenders. This compounds. Early practice involves small surrenders. Years of practice enable surrendering enormous positions whilst maintaining core clarity. The next time you face negotiation or conflict in business, relationships, family matters, enter with extreme clarity about your one non-negotiable. Write it down before the interaction. Everything else is explicitly negotiable. During the discussion, demonstrate willingness to surrender on all peripheral issues immediately and graciously. This appears as flexibility, even weakness, to those who don't understand. But watch what happens. You'll likely get more on peripheral issues than if you'd fought for them, precisely because your willingness to yield signals they don't matter to you, which makes others willing to concede them. Meanwhile, your core position remains completely protected because you've concentrated all your force there. This is mastery, appearing flexible whilst being immovable. The danger is confusing strategic surrender with weakness. When you yield freely on periphery, some will mistake this for exploitable softness. Let them. Their confusion works to your advantage. They will assume you can be pushed on core positions too and discover otherwise. This practice requires genuine non-attachment to peripheral issues. If you secretly care about things you've labeled peripheral, you'll resent surrendering them and the strategy fails. Be honest about what you actually value. You develop what can only be called peaceful invincibility. Circumstances that would devastate others barely move you because they touch only periphery. The setbacks others experience as catastrophic, you experience as data points requiring tactical adjustment. This is not emotional numbness but accurate assessment. Most losses genuinely don't matter relative to core purpose. Recognizing this produces equanimity not through detachment from outcomes, but through precise attachment to what actually matters. You cannot be broken because you know what breaking would actually require, and it's not what others can take. Chapter 14. The Serenity of Clear Discrimination. When you have learned to distinguish core from periphery with precision, you develop equanimity in the face of fortune's reversals, not through stoic suppression of emotion, but through accurate assessment of what you've actually lost. Most setbacks are peripheral. A man who knows his core can lose reputation, position, wealth, even relationships, and remain fundamentally intact if core is preserved. This is not cold detachment, but appropriate emotion scaled to actual loss. You mourn peripheral losses proportionally, but without devastation, knowing core remains untouched. This produces serenity not through achieving a state where nothing can hurt you, but through knowing precisely what would constitute genuine harm versus mere inconvenience. The 1945 electoral defeat, immediately after leading Britain to victory, shocked the world and could have destroyed me. I had given everything to war leadership, 5 years of unrelenting pressure, decisions where millions of lives hung in the balance, sleepless nights whilst the fate of civilization itself was contested. The electorate dismissed me without ceremony. Was this not devastating? It would have been if I had confused victory in war, which was my core purpose, with holding office, which was peripheral. I had achieved my core objective, preserving Britain's freedom. The voters' rejection of my continued leadership was peripheral, even if it wounded pride considerably. The capacity to make this distinction in the moment, not later through rationalization, demonstrated the equanimity that discrimination produces. Most people have two emotional settings, devastation, or indifference. Every loss feels catastrophic or meaningless. But losses exist on a spectrum from trivial to existential. Develop the capacity to scale your emotional response to actual importance. Lost a client? Disappointing, but probably peripheral. Lost your integrity? Potentially core. The man who responds to both identically has lost discrimination. The practice is asking immediately after any setback, did I lose something core or something peripheral? This question calibrates your emotional response to reality rather than to imagination. Here's how to evaluate whether a loss touches core. Can you recover your position through continued effort aligned with your core purpose? If yes, the loss was peripheral position, resources, reputation, all these can be rebuilt. If no, if what was lost was your integrity, your capacity for certain work, your core relationships, then genuine harm has occurred. This test clarifies which losses warrant grief and which warrant merely acknowledgement and adjustment. After any significant setback this month, conduct a 3-step analysis within 24 hours. First, name specifically what was lost. My project failed is too vague. I lost the client contract, which means £50,000 revenue and professional embarrassment, is specific. Second, evaluate against your core using the recovery test. Can this be rebuilt through action aligned with your core purpose? Third, determine the proportional response. If peripheral and recoverable, brief disappointment, then move forward. If core, deeper evaluation of whether you actually suffered core damage or merely fear you did. Usually, upon examination, losses prove peripheral. This systematic analysis prevents emotional catastrophes from peripheral setbacks, whilst ensuring genuine core damage receives appropriate attention. The danger is using this framework to suppress legitimate grief. Some losses genuinely warrant deep mourning, even if peripheral, the death of relationships, the ending of chapters, the loss of possibilities. Equanimity is not emotional flatness, it's accurate emotional response. Others may interpret your equanimity as not caring. Let them. Their confusion is not your problem. You're calibrating responses to reality. They're expecting conventional displays. Your internal peace matters more than their comfort with your reactions. Fortune's reversals, which once produced anxiety and desperate grasping, become navigable. Not painless pain appropriate to actual loss remains but manageable. You develop confidence that most losses won't destroy you because you understand precisely what destruction would require. This produces resilience not through toughness but through clarity. You're not enduring through gritted teeth but recognizing accurately that most challenges don't touch what truly matters. This realization itself is profoundly peaceful, even in difficult circumstances. Peace comes from accurate assessment, not from favorable conditions. You have now developed both the power of strategic surrender and the equanimity of clear discrimination. But one final question remains. Is mastery a destination to be reached, or a capacity that deepens infinitely? Chapter 15. The Infinite Journey. The final truth is both sobering and liberating. Mastery is not a destination but a capacity that deepens infinitely. Even after decades of practice, even now in my 9th decade, I face moments where discrimination is difficult, where ego whispers seductive justifications, where pressure tempts capitulation. The difference is not that difficulty disappears, but that I now face it with capability rather than confusion, with tools rather than terror. Perfection is not possible. What is possible is growing capacity that continues developing throughout life. This means the work never ends, but this is not failure. This is the nature of human excellence. The master is not one who has arrived, but one who continues growing with full awareness that the horizon perpetually recedes. This is glory, not frustration. Late in life, I faced the decision to retire from public life. Every instinct resisted. I had been in Parliament for 64 years, had served as Prime Minister twice, had guided Britain through its darkest hour. Surrendering this identity required discrimination as difficult as any I had faced. Was I maintaining political involvement because it served purpose, or because surrendering it would mean acknowledging mortality and diminished capacity? Even with decades of practice, the discrimination was not automatic. It required conscious work. Mastery had not eliminated difficulty. It had provided capability to face it. The more skilled you become at discrimination, the more complex discriminations you attempt, which maintains difficulty at the edge of your capability. Early practice involves obvious choices: maintain toxic relationship or end it. Advanced practice involves subtle distinctions: Is this relationship toxic or merely challenging? The problems don't disappear, they become more nuanced. This is not regression, but progression into complexity. There is no binary of master versus apprentice, rather, a continuum of growing capability. You're always somewhere on this continuum, always developing, never arrived. Recognition of this prevents two destructive beliefs. First, that you're failing because discrimination remains difficult sometimes. Second, that you've mastered this and need not continue practicing. Both beliefs halt development. Those who begin with clear frameworks rather than discovering them through trial can develop faster than their teachers. This is good. Your capacity to exceed mine comes from starting with the map I had to draw through decades of wandering. Use this advantage, but know you still must walk the territory. Understanding the map is not traveling the landscape. Identify your current edge, the discrimination you find most difficult right now, not years ago, not someday, but now. Perhaps it's maintaining standards in face of financial pressure. Perhaps it's ending relationships that no longer serve. Perhaps it's surrendering control over grown children's choices. Whatever it is, that's where your practice must focus, because that's where growth occurs. Deliberately engage this edge weekly. Each engagement builds capacity, not through eliminating the difficulty, but through improving your ability to navigate it. Track your responses over months. You won't find it becomes easy, but you'll find it becomes more navigable. That's mastery developing, not ease, but growing capability. The two dangers. First, using continued difficulty as evidence of failure. I should have mastered this by now. No, the edge of development is always difficult, that's what makes it the edge. Second, believing you've arrived and can stop practicing. This produces stagnation and regression. The capacity deteriorates with disuse. The ego will try to use your understanding of discrimination as another identity to defend. I'm someone who practices discrimination, becomes another peripheral position requiring surrender when it stops serving growth. You shift from seeking arrival to embracing journey. The frustration of, when will I master this, dissolves into acceptance of, I am developing capacity continuously. This produces peace because it eliminates the anxiety of, am I there yet? You're exactly where you need to be, at your current level of capability, working at your current edge of difficulty, developing through practice. The question is not whether you've arrived, but whether you're growing. That question you can answer affirmatively today and every day. We return then to the beginning, but now understanding what we could not comprehend before. Winners never surrender what matters, but they surrender constantly. They are simultaneously the most flexible and the most rigid of beings. This is not contradiction but wisdom. This is not theory but truth, proven through practice. I offer you not completion but commencement. You now possess the framework, the distinction between core and periphery, the capacity to recognize ego's deceptions, the methods for maintaining discrimination under pressure, the understanding that this practice constitutes freedom itself, and the recognition that mastery is lifelong development rather than final arrival. What remains is the work of embodiment, the years of application, the countless moments of discrimination, the gradual development of capability that approaches mastery without claiming to have arrived. The darkest hour is not when all seems lost. The darkest hour is when you lose the ability to distinguish what must be held from what may be released. Master this discrimination, and no darkness can extinguish your light, no setback can defeat you, no enemy can break you. Come then. The work begins now. The choice, as it has always been, is yours. But now at least you understand what the choice truly is, and what becomes possible when you choose rightly, again and again, until right choosing becomes your nature.